The twin daughters of the widowed millionaire could not sleep until the new black nanny did something that changed everything. "She's drugging those children." Gloria's accusation, the housekeeper's words, echoed through the grand hall of the Whitmore mansion like a gunshot. "James, there's no way those two girls who stayed awake every night are suddenly sleeping like angels. She's doing something illegal to them, the Whitmore mansion." The lights were always on, the floors polished until they gleamed, but the air was heavy. James Whitmore's twin daughters, Ruby and Rose, had not slept through a single night since their mother's death. They would wake up crying in the middle of the night, sometimes calling for her, sometimes just staring blankly at the ceiling, as if even in their dreams they could not find peace. And James, a man who could sign a check that moved millions, was powerless before two little girls who only needed something money could never buy. That was the world Kesha walked into, a world where silence had teeth. You know this kind of silence, don't you? It doesn't just sit in a room. It presses down, waiting for someone to break it. She didn't wear expensive clothes, nor did she act as if she were entering a place where men like James held power. She came in with steady eyes, the kind that never flinch from judgment. Perhaps you've met a woman like that once in your life. The kind who makes you feel that she isn't here to ask permission, only to do what must be done. Gloria, the housekeeper, disliked her from the very start. You could see it in the way her smile tightened every time Kesha spoke. Gloria had been in this house for 15 years. In her mind, this was her kingdom, and kingdoms do not welcome it, especially not outsiders who carried both quiet dignity and skin that reminded Gloria of everything she didn't want near James's perfect little world. The twins didn't warm up to Kesha right away either. Children rarely trust new faces. But on her second night there, when Ruby woke up crying at 2 in the morning, Kesha didn't rush, didn't plead. She simply sat at the edge of the bed and hummed an old song, a song her grandmother used to sing on sweltering southern nights. And slowly, almost unbelievably, Ruby's sobs quieted. Rose curled up in her own bed, peeked out from under her blanket and watched. By the time Kesha finished, both girls were sound asleep. James stood in the doorway and saw it all. A man accustomed to controlling boardrooms and shaking markets found himself brought to his knees by the sight of a stranger doing for his daughters what he could not. That was the first crack in the walls around his heart. But Gloria saw something else. She saw a threat. You know the kind of fear that doesn't roar but hisses through clenched teeth, don't you? That was how Gloria moved after that night. She whispered doubts into James's ear, planting them like seeds. "She's too bold. She's overstepping, You don't know people like her." At first, James ignored it all. After all, the girls were finally sleeping. The house felt warmer, lighter somehow. But prejudice has a way of creeping in like a draft under a locked door. And Gloria knew exactly how to open it wider. What no one knew, not Gloria, not James, was that Kesha had not come to this house with lullabies alone. She carried the weight of her brother's firing from Whitmore Industries, a dismissal cloaked in corporate language but stained with something far uglier. Kesha wasn't here just to care for the children. She was here for the truth, and she was patient enough to wait for it. For weeks, she kept her head down. She played games with the twins, taught them how to read the stars, and earned their laughter, the way a gardener earns a bloom through quiet, constant tending. But when the girls slept, she listened. She noticed what others would overlook: Gloria's late-night phone calls. The way she spoke James's name with the familiarity of someone who believed she owned a piece of his life. And slowly a pattern emerged. One night, after the girls had fallen asleep, Kesha stood alone in the kitchen. She stared at the tablet in her hand, where her recordings from that day played back. Words from Gloria, casual, poisonous words, spoken in the comfort of believing no one would ever hold her accountable. If you've ever seen injustice laid bare, not in headlines, but in the small, cruel ways it hides in ordinary life, it doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like a stone in your chest. Kesha didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She only pressed save and turned off the screen because this wasn't about revenge. It was about building something that could not be ignored. James noticed the change in her, though he couldn't name it. There was steel beneath her calm now, a certainty that unsettled him. Yet every time he looked at Ruby and Rose sleeping soundly, sleeping as if the world was finally safe, he pushed those questions. But the storm was already gathering. Because the night was coming, when Kesha would no longer hum lullabies in the quiet, she would speak. And when she did, the foundations of James Whitmore's life, his home, his company, his faith in the people he trusted, would shake so hard that nothing would remain untouched. And if you think that sounds dramatic, ask yourself this, Bryn, what happens when the truth is no longer whispered, but dragged into the light for everyone to see? The storm did not arrive with thunder. It came in quiet ways, like the sound of a door closing at midnight, or a single word spoken in a room where no one was supposed to hear. Kesha moved through the Whitmore mansion as if she had always belonged there. Not because she was welcomed, but because she refused to be invisible. The twins clung to her now. Even their father noticed how Ruby's laughter returned first, like sunlight after a long rain. And Rose followed close behind. Every step forward for Kesha brought Gloria's shadow closer. Gloria's whispers sharpened. She spoke of boundaries and propriety. But her words carried something colder. Fear. Not fear of Kesha herself, but fear of what she represented. A truth that could not be controlled. And if you were standing there in that kitchen, you would have felt it too. The way Gloria looked at Kesha wasn't just dislike. It was the way someone stares at a locked door they know will eventually open. One night, James called Kesha into his study. He was a man used to commanding, but in that moment he seemed strangely unsure, like a soldier who had lost his map. "They sleep now," he said, almost in disbelief. "The doctors couldn't. Nothing worked." "And you?" He stopped, rubbing his jaw, searching for the words. Kesha didn't flinch. "Children don't need medicine to feel safe," she said softly. "They need someone who doesn't leave." For a moment, James just stared at her. Maybe it was the simplicity of her words. Maybe it was the way she said them, like truth was not a weapon, but a quiet kind of mercy. And in that pause, something shifted. You could see it if you were watching closely. Rendell, the way his shoulders eased, the faint look of a man who'd been holding his breath for far too long. But upstairs, Gloria was listening. That night, Kesha found a folded note on the counter. No signature, just 6 words. "Surrent people like you don't belong here." She didn't tear it up. She didn't even frown. Instead, she tucked it into her apron pocket, right beside the small notebook where she kept her records. Not of the twins' routines, but of Gloria's calls, dates, times, words caught in passing. Because Kesha understood something that James didn't yet route. The fight was never in the open. It was always in the quiet corners, where no one else bothered to look. 2 weeks later, the twins had their first nightmare-free month. James bought them a telescope for the upstairs balcony. Co and Kesha showed them how to map the constellations. "That one's Orion," she whispered. "Oh," and Rose's small hand clung to hers, as though the stars themselves might slip away if she let go. James stood in the doorway that night. He wasn't a man given to poetry, but he thought, just for a fleeting second, that Kesha didn't look like an employee in that moment. She looked like the kind of anchor you pray for when you're lost at sea. And then, like a crack in glass, Gloria's voice cut through the peace. "She's overstepping, James," she said, arms folded. "You don't see it now, but you will." He didn't answer her, not then, because how could he explain the unexplainable? How could he tell Gloria that for the first time since his wife's funeral, his house didn't feel like a tomb? That silence, his silence, was the permission Gloria needed. She doubled her efforts. And while Kesha continued to soothe the twins to sleep and build her quiet case piece by piece, Gloria made her move. Late one evening, as Kesha carried Rose upstairs, she caught sight of Gloria by the study door. Phone pressed to her ear, voice low but urgent. Kesha didn't confront her. She didn't have to. Because when you've lived long enough watching lies unravel, you learn patience. And that night, when the twins were finally asleep, Kesha opened her tablet. She didn't just listen this time. She smiled, faint and steady, because she had what she needed. If you've ever held the truth in your hands, now you know it doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with stillness, the kind of stillness before a storm finally breaks. And for Gloria, that storm was coming. It began with the smallest tremor, a question asked at the wrong time, a glance that lasted a second too long. James noticed it, though he didn't yet understand what it meant. Kesha, on the other hand, understood perfectly. She had seen storms like this before. You could feel it in the air, the way silence deepens before thunder speaks. The twins clung closer to her now, their fear dissolving with every steady night's sleep. Ruby was laughing again. Rose, who once whimpered at shadows, now chased them in play, fearless. And James, he was watching Kesha differently, not with the hunger of a lonely man, but with the quiet gratitude of someone who has been rescued without ever asking for it. But gratitude is dangerous in a house like this. It draws eyes, it sharpens knives. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the estate, Gloria appeared in the doorway of the nursery. Her voice was smooth, but it carried a weight that didn't belong in a room full of children. "James," she said, we need to talk about boundaries." About her, Kesha didn't flinch. She tucked the twins into bed, her hands gentle, precise. If you had been standing there, you might have thought she didn't even hear Gloria. But she heard every word, every tremor in Gloria's voice. James stepped forward. His hand brushed the doorframe, the way a man steadies himself when the ground starts to shift. "She stays," he said simply. Gloria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "For now," she replied, as though the words were a promise she intended to break. That night, after the house grew still, Kesha sat alone in the kitchen. The note Gloria had left her before, "People like you don't belong here," was still in her apron pocket. She smoothed it flat on the table. Studied the ink as if it were a map. And then placed it beside her notebook. Every call Gloria made, every hushed conversation, every whisper caught in passing. Because if there's one thing you should know about Kesha, it's this burial. She didn't fight wars with shouting. She fought them with evidence, and quietly, methodically, she was winning. A week later, James asked Kesha to join him in his study. His words were slower this time, heavier. "I don't know what it is you do," he said, staring at the fire, but they're not afraid anymore. I think you've saved them." Kesha didn't answer, not with words. She simply looked at him, steady and unshaken. And in that silence, James saw something he hadn't felt in years: certainty. But outside that study, Gloria waited, and when a woman like Gloria waits, she sharpens her teeth. She called her lawyer the next morning. Kesha knew, of course, she always knew. If you've ever been underestimated, you know what power feels like. It's not loud, it doesn't roar. It's quiet, patient, and unstoppable, and Kesha, calm, unshaken Kesha, was about to prove it. The storm finally broke. It was the kind of day when nothing should have happened. Quiet, almost painfully ordinary. But sometimes that's when the ground shifts. Kesha had just finished helping Ruby and Rose with their morning lessons. James stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching his daughters laugh for the first time in what felt like years. That laughter, it healed something in him, even if he couldn't yet name what. And then Gloria walked in. She didn't bother knocking. Her voice cut through the warmth of the room like cold steel. "James, we need to talk." Alone, Kesha didn't move. Neither did the twins. The only sound was the tick of the grandfather clock. James set down his cup slowly, the kind of slow that tells you a man has already made his choice. "Say what you need to say," he told her. Gloria's eyes flicked to Kesha. "She's manipulating the children," she said. Each word sharp enough to draw blood. "I've served this family for 15 years, James. I've protected your reputation, your home. And now you let her." But she didn't finish. Because Kesha, calm as midnight, reached into her bag and placed her tablet on the table. No dramatics. No anger. Just precision. "Are you sure you want to continue?" she asked softly. Gloria scoffed. "Is that supposed to scare me?" Kesha pressed play. And there it was, smear down Gloria's voice, clear as day, at Ruby's birthday party just a month ago. Surrounded by 20 of the city's most powerful families. She had whispered to Mrs. Henderson Reld, people like her shouldn't have access to children from traditional families. The room froze. James stared at Gloria as if he were seeing her for the first time. "You said this in front of my friends, my daughter's friends." Gloria's face drained of color. "James, But Kesha wasn't finished. With one swipe, another screen lit up. Durant WhatsApp messages, each one worse than the last. Photos of Kesha shared without permission, speculation, cruel words wrapped in the language of concern. James stepped closer, the fire in his voice unmistakable. "You violated my family's privacy. You turned my home into your little court of judgment." Kesha didn't smile. She didn't need to. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, not for revenge, but for truth. "Gloria," she said evenly, "you wanted this fight, so let's have it." And that was only the beginning. James's hands trembled not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what he was seeing. Kesha opened another folder on her tablet, this one colder, sharper, more damning than anything before. "Do you remember," Kesha asked quietly, "recommending the dismissal of 3 employees at Whitmore Industries in the last 2 years?" Gloria's jaw clenched. "I don't know what you're talking about," but the tablet did. Names appeared, one after another, on a neatly organized spreadsheet. Jennifer Watson, financial analyst; David Miller, and then Marcus Johnson. James stared at the list, his voice low like the rumble before a storm. "These are our people." "These are my employees." Kesha nodded. "Jennifer, fired after Gloria suggested she didn't fit the company's culture. David, demoted to a department where his talent would be wasted. And Marcus, my brother you called human resources. You said he might not be the right fit. Didn't that call cost him his job?" Gloria's lips trembled. I was trying to protect the company. Protect it from what? James snapped. From competence? From decency? Kesha swiped again, and this time it wasn't just names. It was proof-darned emails, recordings, timestamps. And there it was, Gloria's fingerprints on every single one of them. James rubbed his forehead, as if trying to keep his anger from exploding. Gloria, you've been advising my HR department? Advising, Kesha said, or dictating. Over the past 3 years, 16 Black or Latino employees were fired or demoted. And in 60% of those cases, there was an email or a call from her, always framed as cultural concerns or questions about fit, into always poison wrapped in politeness. The room went silent. You could almost hear the sound of something breaking, James's trust, his illusions, maybe even his patience. And then Ruby came running in her hands, a drawing. Daddy, look, it's Kesha reading us a story. James looked at his daughter's innocent smile, then at the drawing pale Kesha sitting between his girls, pointing at a book, their faces lit with joy. Rose followed, holding another picture, this one of Kesha showing them the stars in the night sky. For a moment, James didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The truth was already there, locked in the laughter of his children, Keo, and the evidence glowing on Kesha's tablet. Gloria, he said at last, his voice steady, almost frighteningly calm, you're finished here. Pack your things. Her face crumbled. James, 15 years. I raised those girls. No, he said, you taught them to sleep with fear in their own home, and I let you. But not anymore. And in that instant, for the first time in years, James Whitmore wasn't just a man protecting his company. He was a father. Gloria's protest turned to pleading, but James didn't flinch. His daughters stood in the doorway, holding their drawings, watching the scene with wide-eyed confusion. He knelt down to their level, his voice softening. Girls, why don't you take your pictures out to the garden? Daddy needs to finish something very important. They nodded and scampered off, their laughter fading down the hallway, leaving behind a silence so heavy to press against the walls. James straightened, turning back to Gloria, his face set like stone. You have 1 hour, he said. 1 hour to pack your things and leave this house. And if I find out you so much as set foot in my company again, I'll make sure every executive in this city knows what you've done. Gloria's lips trembled. James, please, I was protecting? His voice cracked like a whip. You weren't protecting anyone. You poisoned this house. You used my trust to burn good people's lives down to ashes. Kesha stood quietly by the window, tablet still in her hand. But her eyes never left James. She saw it. This was no longer just about firing a housekeeper. This was about a man waking up to the wreckage around him, the kind of wreckage privilege had kept him blind to for far too long. James, Kesha said, stepping closer, there's more you need to see. He turned, tired but listening. She opened one last folder. Inside was a list, not of firings this time, but of hires. Or rather, the hires that never happened. 23 candidates, Kesha said, all highly qualified, 2 engineers from MIT, an award-winning architect, an analyst with an MBA from Harvard, all rejected. James stared at the screen, jaw tightening. Why? Because, Kesha continued, Gloria did her own informal background checks. She called their families. She asked about their neighborhoods. And every single one of them, Black or Latino, James felt something twist deep inside. We didn't just lose them, he murmured. We threw them away. Not we, Kesha corrected softly. Gloria stepped forward, desperate. James, she's setting me up. This is all a trap. Can't you see that? But James wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at Kesha, at the calm precision in her eyes, the quiet certainty in her voice. A woman who didn't scream or didn't threaten, didn't need to. She simply laid the truth bare, I know, piece by piece now, until there was nowhere left for lies to hide. And for the first time, James felt something he hadn't in years. Clarity. "Gloria," he said, his voice like iron, "leave, now." And for a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, Gloria realized he meant it. 15 years of quiet power collapsed in an instant, Kate leaving her small and hollow. She turned, and for the first time in a long time, Gloria Whitmore, the housekeeper who once ruled this mansion like a queen, looked like nothing more than a servant dismissed. Kesha didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Justice, when clean, has no need for triumph. It only requires truth. The door shut behind Gloria, with a sound that felt final, like a curtain dropping at the end of a long, bitter play. For a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the air conditioning and the faint, distant laughter of the twins in the garden. James stood in the middle of his vast living room, a man surrounded by all the things money could buy, and none of them seemed to matter anymore. Kesha closed the tablet and placed it gently on the marble counter. "It's done," she said. But James didn't answer. He stared at the door, as if expecting it to swing open again, half expecting Gloria to come storming back in with that sharp, commanding voice that had long ago filled this house more than his own. Only now he realized what Kesha had already known remedial, that voice had been a shadow. And shadows always vanish when the light is strong enough. "Mr. Whitmore," Kesha said softly, stepping closer, "your girls are safe now." He turned to her then, not with the look of a man who had won, but with the weary gaze of someone who had finally stopped losing. He nodded once, a small gesture, but it carried the weight of gratitude he couldn't yet put into words. And then, from the garden, came the sound of footsteps. 2 small sets, quick and eager. The twins burst into the room, cheeks flushed with sunshine and wild joy. "Daddy!" one cried. "Miss Kesha! Look what we made." In their tiny hands were paper crowns, messy with glue and glitter. They ran to James first, plopping one crookedly on his head, then to Kesha, crowning her with equal ceremony. Kesha laughed, but there was a softness in her eyes as she knelt to their level. "Your Highnesses," she said, bowing with playful grace, "these are the finest crowns I've ever seen." James watched them, his daughters clinging to Kesha's arms, their little faces bright, in a way he hadn't seen in months. And for the first time in a long while, he understood something simple and unshakable, staring all the money, the houses, the power. It had never been for him, it was for them. For these 2 small souls who had been carrying the quiet grief of their mother's absence, without ever having the words for it. And somehow, this woman, this stranger who had walked into his house, with calm eyes and steady hands, had given them back their laughter. That night, the house was different. No sharp voices, no tension lingering in the corners. The twins ate their dinner giggling, between spoonfuls of mashed potatoes. Kesha hummed while clearing the table, the kind of sound that makes a home feel alive. When bedtime came, James stood in the doorway and watched as Kesha tucked the girls in. She didn't read from a book, she didn't tell them a story. Instead, she sang. It was a low, warm melody, something old, something rooted deep, in a place that spoke to the heart rather than the mind. The twins' eyelids grew heavy almost at once. One nestled against her pillow, the other curled closer to her sister. James stayed there, leaning against the frame, and for a moment, it felt like watching a miracle unfold, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that settles in your bones and never leaves. When Kesha finished, she looked over at him. "They're asleep," she whispered, and somehow it felt like the whole house exhaled with those words. James nodded. "Thank you," he said, and his voice carried a depth he hadn't let anyone hear in years. Kesha didn't reply. She only smiled the smallest smile, as though she understood that some things don't need words. Outside, the world kept turning. Deals were made, fortunes shifted, and people chased after the next thing. But in that mansion, for the first time in a long time, and in the quiet that followed, James realized something he hadn't expected. He wasn't just looking at a nanny. He was looking at the only person who had walked into his world and refused to be impressed by it. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what he needed. The night was still when James stepped out onto the balcony. The city below glittered with 1,000 restless lights, but up here, there was only silence. Kesha stood beside him, arms folded, gazing at the same horizon. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Inside, the twins slept without fear. For the first time in weeks, their breathing was steady. Like the sound of a house finally learning how to rest, James cleared his throat. "I used to think," he said quietly, that if I worked hard enough, earned enough, controlled enough, I could keep the world from touching them, but I couldn't stop it. Not the grief, not the nightmares, not the loneliness." Kesha didn't turn to him. She only kept her eyes on the distance and said, "You don't stop storms by building higher walls. You hold them, you let the wind pass through, and then when it's quiet, you teach them the sky was always theirs." Her words lingered. They cut through him not sharply, but the way sunlight cuts through a cold room. He'd spent years locking everything behind marble and steel, thinking safety came from barriers. But here was this woman, this stranger, who had walked into his house, and, without permission, you torn the walls down until all that was left was something raw, something human. And he wasn't angry, he was grateful. He looked at her then, really looked at her. There was no performance in Kesha, no trace of flattery, no calculation. She was steady, like a stone in a river, unmoved by its current, and somehow, cold, the water bent around her. "You changed this house," he said. Kesha shook her head. "No, they changed it. I just reminded them how." But James knew better. He'd seen the way the twins clung to her, the way their laughter came back only in her presence. He'd felt it himself, his own heart shifting, slow and unwilling at first. Undeniable now. Like an old machine remembering how to turn, the night stretched quiet between them, heavy with everything unspoken. For once, James didn't feel the need to fill it. Inside, one of the twins stirred in her sleep and murmured something small, sweet, and dream-soft. Kesha turned at the sound, and for a fleeting second, there was a gentleness in her face that James would remember for the rest of his life. He knew then money, status, power, none of it had ever been the thing. It was this: a house no longer hollow, children who slept without fear, a woman who carried storms in her hands and taught them how to quiet, and somewhere deep inside, a man who had been lost in his own success finally found the courage to stop. When dawn came, the sky opened wide, soft and golden. Kesha stood in the garden with the twins, their tiny hands in hers, their laughter floating like music into the morning. James watched from the balcony, a man who no longer needed to hold the world in his grip, because at last he understood Thank you for following this story on Shoe Stories. If this story moved you, taught you something, or made you reflect on the meaning of silence, please like, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below the video. Your voice matters. Let it be heard, whether it's in silence or loud, and don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos displayed on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity and unexpected heroes. We'll see you in the next story.